I never thought my brother would disappear after borrowing $23,000 from me. The morning I realized Caleb wasn't coming back, I was watering the marigolds in my kitchen window, watching the steam rise from my coffee cup like tiny ghosts of all the promises he'd broken over the years. 52 years old, and I was still cleaning up his messes, still believing that this time would be different. The empty coffee cup sat on my counter for 3 days after he vanished, a stubborn reminder of our last conversation when he'd sworn on our parents' graves that he'd pay me back within 6 months. But what if, instead of waiting for him to keep his word, I finally kept mine to myself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pressed flower journal lay open on my kitchen table, its yellowed pages filled with botanical illustrations I'd been working on since dawn. Each delicate sketch represented hours of careful observation. The way morning light caught the translucent petals of a cosmos, how the veins of a maple leaf created their own intricate highway system. This work had become my sanctuary, the one place where I could lose myself completely and forget about the chaos that seemed to follow my younger brother wherever he went. My house sat on the edge of Millbrook, Illinois, population 8,047, according to the weathered sign by the grain. Elevator. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. A modest 2-story with faded blue siding and a wraparound porch that needed painting. But inside, every surface bloomed with life. Hanging planters cascaded from the ceiling. Windowsills overflowed with succulents, and my converted sunroom had become a greenhouse where I grew the flowers I pressed and painted for my freelance botanical illustration work. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny fairies above my workspace. I'd been up since 5, unable to sleep, my mind churning over the conversation I'd had with Caleb 3 days ago. He'd sat in this very chair, his familiar charming smile in place, asking for money again. Not asking, really. More like assuming I'd say yes, the way he always did. "Joe, you know I'm good for it," he'd said, running his hands through his still thick brown hair. At 48, Caleb looked like he could have stepped off the cover of a men's magazine if you ignored the slight tremor in his hands and the way his eyes never quite met mine anymore. This restaurant opportunity is different. Real different. I've got investors lined up, just need some bridge funding until the paperwork clears. I'd heard variations of this speech for 30 years. The restaurant, the sports bar, the landscaping business, the vintage car restoration shop. Each venture started with grand plans and ended with Caleb disappearing for months, leaving behind a trail of unpaid debts and disappointed partners. And somehow, I always found myself at the center of the cleanup crew. But this time felt different, and not in the way Caleb meant. This time, I'd saved that money for something specific, something that was mine alone, for the first time in my adult life. I had enough set aside to lease a small storefront downtown and open the flower shop I'd been dreaming about since high school. I'd even driven by the empty space on Main Street, imagining how I'd arrange the displays where I'd hang my botanical prints, how I'd design the workroom in the back. 23,000! I'd repeated slowly, watching his face. That's everything I have saved, Caleb. I know it's a lot to ask. His voice had taken on that little boy quality that used to work on our mother. But think about it, Joe. When this takes off, I can pay you back with interest. Real interest. You could open 10 flower shops. I'd wanted to laugh, but it would have come out bitter. Caleb had been promising to pay me back, with interest, since he was 25, and needed money for his first failed business venture. The promises always sounded so sincere, so reasonable. And I always believed them because I wanted to. Because believing meant there was still hope that my little brother would become the man I'd raised him to be after our parents died. The car accident happened when I was 22, and Caleb was 18. Just weeks before he was supposed to start college on a partial baseball scholarship. I'd been finishing my junior year at art school, finally finding my voice as an illustrator, when the call came. One icy February morning, a semi-truck ran a red light and changed everything. Within a month, I'd dropped out to come home and take care of Caleb, who was struggling with grief and guilt and a shoulder injury that ended his baseball dreams. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd go back to school once Caleb got on his feet. But temporary had a way of becoming permanent when you were dealing with someone who couldn't seem to find solid ground. Every time Caleb stumbled, I was there to catch him. Every time he had a new idea, a new plan, a new opportunity that just needed a little financial support, I found a way to help. The botanical illustration work had started as a way to make ends meet while supporting us both. What began as simple sketches for a local garden center had gradually grown into a modest freelance business. I created illustrations for seed companies, garden magazines, and educational materials. It wasn't art school, but it was art. It was mine. And slowly, over the years, I'd built up enough of a reputation to dream about something bigger. "Joanna," my neighbor Lena's voice called from the back door, followed by the sound of her key in the lock. Lena Ortiz had lived next door for 15 years, and we'd fallen into the comfortable routine of friends who understood that privacy was optional and coffee was mandatory. "In the kitchen," I called back, closing the flower journal and reaching for 2 mugs. Lena appeared in the doorway, her silver hair still damp from her morning shower, wearing the kind of practical clothes that announced she had gardening plans. At 68, she moved with the purposeful energy of someone who'd learned not to waste time on things that didn't matter. "You look like hell," she said with characteristic directness, settling into the chair across from me. "Please tell me you didn't give him the money." I poured coffee into both mugs, adding the cream and sugar I knew she preferred. Lena had taught middle school for 35 years before retiring, and she had a teacher's ability to see through polite deflection. "He needed it," I said quietly. Joanna Marie Briggs. The full name treatment meant I was in trouble. "You promised me you wouldn't do this again." "This is different. It's always different, and it's always the same." Lena wrapped her hands around her mug, studying my face with the intensity that had probably terrified generations of 12-year-olds. What was it this time? Another restaurant? I nodded, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. When spoken aloud, especially to Lena, Caleb's latest scheme sounded as flimsy as tissue paper. "And you gave him your flower shop money." It wasn't a question. Lena had been there when I'd first started talking about opening the shop, had helped me research lease agreements and business licenses, had even offered to help with the initial inventory. She'd been more excited about my dream than I'd allowed myself to be. "He's going to pay me back," I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "When?" 6 months. Lena snorted, a sound that somehow managed to convey 3 decades of disappointment in my judgment. "And where is he now? 3 days later?" That was the question I'd been avoiding. Caleb had promised to call the next day with details about the restaurant, about timelines and partnerships and repayment schedules. But my phone had remained stubbornly silent. When I'd tried calling him, it went straight to voicemail. His landlord said he'd cleared out of his apartment 2 days ago. "I don't know," I admitted. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the morning sun creep across my kitchen table. Outside, I could hear the distant rumble of farm equipment and the closer sound of Mrs. Henderson's dog barking at the mail carrier. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but they had the courtesy to pretend they didn't. "You know what this is, don't you?" Lena finally said. "This is you buying your way out of guilt that isn't even yours to carry." I'd heard this speech before, but it never got easier to listen to. Lena had been the one to point out that I'd spent 30 years trying to save Caleb from himself, and that maybe it was time to save myself instead. "He's my brother," I said, "and you're not his mother. You were barely an adult yourself when your parents died." Lena leaned forward, her voice gentling slightly. "You did more than enough, Joanna. You gave up your dreams, your education, your 20s and 30s. You've been there for every crisis, every failed business, every time he's needed somewhere to land. When is it enough?" I traced the rim of my coffee mug with one finger, avoiding her eyes. The truth was, I'd been asking myself the same question for years. When I turned 40, I'd wondered if it was too late to go back to school. When I turned 45, I'd started the flower shop fund. When I turned 50, I'd begun to seriously research what it would take to make the dream a reality. But every time I got close to taking that leap, Caleb would appear with a crisis or an opportunity, and I'd find myself swept back into the familiar role of the responsible older sister who fixed things. It was easier in some ways than risking failure on my own dreams. "The worst part," I said slowly, "is that I knew, even as I was writing the check, I knew he wasn't going to pay me back." "Then why did you do it?" I considered lying, giving her the same excuses I'd been giving myself. But Lena deserved honesty, and maybe I did too, because saying no would have meant admitting that my brother isn't who I need him to be. And if I admit that, then I have to face the fact that I've wasted 30 years of my life propping up someone who was never going to stand on his own. Lena reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was warm and soft, marked with age spots and the small scars that came from a lifetime of gardening. "Honey, those 30 years weren't wasted. You kept him alive. You kept him fed and housed and out of serious trouble. But that doesn't mean you have to keep doing it forever." "I don't know how to stop," I admitted. "This is who I am. This is who I've always been." "No," Lena said firmly. "This is who you became because you had to. But you don't have to anymore. Caleb is a grown man, and whatever happens to him from here on out, that's his responsibility." She stood up, carrying her empty mug to the sink and rinsing it with the efficient movements of someone who'd been taking care of herself for a long time. "You want some advice from an old woman who learned this lesson the hard way?" I nodded. "Stop waiting for him to give you permission to live your own life. Stop waiting for him to become someone worthy of all the sacrifice you've made. Stop waiting for the perfect moment when you've saved enough money, or have enough courage, or feel ready enough." She turned to face me, her expression fierce with affection. "Start today, right now. What's one thing you can do today that's just for you?" After Lena left, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the gentle chaos of my botanical work. The pressed flowers seemed to mock me from their careful arrangements. All these beautiful things I'd preserved and documented, but never really lived among. I'd spent so many years pressing flowers instead of planting gardens, illustrating other people's dreams instead of cultivating my own. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment, my heart jumped with the hope that it might be Caleb, with an explanation, an apology, a promise that this time would be different. But it was just a notification from my bank, confirming that the check I'd written 3 days ago had cleared. $23,000. Gone. I walked to my sunroom, where the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the windows, casting long shadows across my workbench. This room had become my refuge over the years, filled with the tools of my trade: microscopes and magnifying glasses, watercolor paints and pencils, pressing boards and specimen jars. It was here that I'd learned to see beauty in the smallest details, to capture the essential nature of a flower in just a few careful lines. But as I stood there, surrounded by all the equipment for documenting life rather than living it, I realized that Lena was right. I'd been preserving moments instead of creating them, saving money instead of spending it on experiences, waiting for someday instead of embracing today. My laptop sat open on the workbench, displaying the latest commission I'd been working on. A series of illustrations for a seed catalog. Good work, steady money, but ultimately just another way of keeping myself safely on the sidelines of life. On impulse, I opened a new browser tab and searched for 1967 Mustang Fastback for sale, Illinois. It was crazy, reckless, completely unlike me. But as the search results populated, I found myself remembering all the times Caleb had talked about his dream car, the classic Mustang he was going to buy someday when his ship came in. He'd had pictures printed out from the internet, had known every specification, every option package, every subtle difference between the model years. "When I get my Mustang," he used to say, "everything will be different." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, looking at the very car my brother had dreamed about, but never worked toward, using money I'd given him that he'd never pay back. But instead of feeling bitter, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a spark of pure selfish want. There it was, 3 listings down, 1967, Mustang Fastback, Rally Pack, 289 V8, numbers matching, recent restoration. The asking price was exactly what I'd given Caleb. I clicked on the listing and found myself staring at photographs of the most beautiful car I'd ever seen. Deep blue paint that seemed to glow from within, chrome that caught the light like jewelry, an interior that looked like it had been crafted by someone who understood that driving could be an art form. The seller was in Springfield, just 2 hours away. The description mentioned that it had been a labor of love, restored by a retired mechanic who was downsizing. It had been his weekend car, garage kept, driven only on sunny days. I stared at the screen for a long time, my heart beating faster than it had in years. This was insane. I didn't even know how to drive a manual transmission. I'd never owned anything more exciting than my practical Honda Civic. I was a 52-year-old woman who pressed flowers and lived quietly, and had never done anything spontaneous in her entire life. But maybe that was exactly the problem. Before I could lose my nerve, I picked up my phone and dialed the number in the listing. The drive to Springfield felt like the longest 2 hours of my life. I'd arranged to meet the seller, a man named Frank Morrison, at his house on Saturday morning. All week I'd been second-guessing myself, coming up with a dozen reasons why buying the Mustang was a terrible idea. But every time I started to chicken out, I'd remember the empty coffee cup on my counter and Caleb's casual assumption that my money was his money. Frank Morrison lived in a neat ranch house with a 3-car garage that looked like it could double as a showroom. He was waiting for me in the driveway when I pulled up, a compact man in his 70s with calloused hands and eyes that sparkled with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for grandchildren. "You must be Joanna," he said, walking over to shake my hand. "I have to say, I was surprised to get your call. Don't usually get many women interested in the old muscle cars." "I'm full of surprises," I said, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "Well, let's see what you think of her." He led me to the garage and hit a button that sent the middle door rolling up with mechanical precision. And there she was, exactly like the photos, but somehow more real, more immediate. The Mustang sat in the center of the bay like a sleeping predator, all curves and promise. 9067, fastback, Frank said, running his hand along the hood with obvious affection. Factory rally pack, 289 V8, 4-speed manual. I bought her as a project car 15 years ago, spent weekends and summers bringing her back to life. I walked around the car slowly, taking in details I'd never noticed in the photographs. The way the light reflected off the deep blue paint, the aggressive slope of the rear window, the dual exhaust tips that hinted at the power underneath. Why? Are you selling her? I asked. Frank's expression grew wistful. My wife passed last year. Catherine always said I loved this car more than I loved her, which wasn't true, but wasn't entirely false either. He chuckled softly. Now it just sits here reminding me of Saturday mornings when she'd bring me coffee while I worked on her. Seems wrong to let something this beautiful just sit. He popped the hood, revealing an engine bay that looked like it had been detailed for a car show. Every component was either restored or replaced, every surface clean enough to eat off. She runs like a dream, Frank continued. I drive her maybe 1,000 miles a year, just enough to keep everything working properly. All the maintenance records are here, plus the original paperwork from when she was first sold. I stood there listening to him talk about compression, ratios, and carburetor rebuilds, understanding maybe half of what he said, but feeling something shift inside me with every word. This wasn't just a car. It was a time machine, a rebellion, a statement I'd never had the courage to make. Can I see the inside? Frank opened the driver's door, and I slipped behind the wheel. The bucket seats hugged me like they'd been waiting 30 years for me to arrive. The steering wheel was larger than I was used to. The dashboard simpler, more honest somehow. No digital displays or computer screens, just gauges that would tell me exactly what the engine was thinking. Want to take her for a spin? Frank asked. My mouth went dry. I've never driven a manual transmission. No time like the present. It's easier than people think, and once you get the hang of it, you'll never want to go back to automatic. 20 minutes later, after stalling the engine only twice and grinding the gears only once, I was driving down a quiet country road with the windows down and the exhaust note rumbling behind me like contained thunder. The Mustang felt alive, in a way my Honda never had, responding to every input with mechanical honesty. What do you think? Frank asked from the passenger seat. I think I'm in trouble, I said, and he laughed. That's what every Mustang owner says eventually. We spent another hour going over the car's history, the maintenance schedules, the quirks and characteristics that came with owning a 56-year-old machine. Frank had clearly loved this car, and I could see the conflicted emotions in his face as he prepared to let it go. Can I ask you something? He said as we stood in his driveway, the car keys heavy in my palm. Of course. You don't seem like the typical classic car buyer. Most folks who come to look at her already know everything there is to know about first-generation Mustangs. You're starting from scratch. What's the story? I considered giving him a simple answer. Something about midlife crisis or always wanting a classic car. But there was something about Frank's genuine curiosity, his obvious love for the machine he was entrusting to me, that deserved honesty. My younger brother has wanted this exact car his entire adult life, I said slowly. He's got pictures, specs, everything. Always said he'd buy one someday when he got his life together. And you're buying it instead? I'm buying it because I just gave him $23,000, and he disappeared. The words came out more bitter than I'd intended. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent 30 years cleaning up his messes and funding his dreams. This time, I'm funding my own. Frank nodded thoughtfully. Sounds like this car is going to be more than just transportation for you. I hope so. He handed me the title, already signed and ready for transfer. Take care of her, Joanna. And remember, life's too short to drive boring cars. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive home took 3 hours because I had to stop twice to collect myself. Once at a gas station in Lincoln, where I sat in the parking lot staring at the steering wheel and wondering what the hell I'd just done. And once at a roadside park south of Bloomington, where I called Lena and told her I'd bought a car. What kind of car? She asked. A 1967 Mustang Fastback. Silence. Lena. I'm here. I'm just trying to picture you in a muscle car. It's blue, I said helplessly. Does it run? Like a dream, according to Frank. Who's Frank? The man I bought it from. He restored it himself over 15 years. Another pause. Joanna, honey, are you having some kind of breakdown? I laughed, surprising myself. Maybe. But if I am, it's the most expensive breakdown in the history of Millbrook. Are you happy? The question caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had asked me that? When was the last time I'd even asked myself? I think so, I said, terrified but happy. Then drive that beautiful machine home and we'll figure out the rest later. By the time I pulled into my driveway, word had spread. Millbrook was the kind of town where the arrival of a classic car was news, and Mrs. Henderson from across the street was already standing at her mailbox, pretending to check for mail she knew wouldn't arrive for another 3 hours. I sat in the car for a moment after turning off the engine, my hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of driving something so fundamentally different from anything I'd ever owned. The silence felt strange after 2 hours of rumbling exhaust and wind noise. My phone buzzed with a text message. For just a moment, my heart jumped with the old familiar hope that it might be Caleb. But it was just a notification from my bank about the electronic transfer I'd made to Frank Morrison's account. $23,000. The exact amount I'd given my brother 3 weeks ago. I climbed out of the car and walked around to look at it from the street perspective. It looked impossibly glamorous, sitting in my modest driveway, like a thoroughbred horse in a petting zoo. The deep blue paint seemed to glow in the afternoon sun, and I could see my reflection distorted in the chrome bumper. Mrs. Henderson had given up all pretense of checking her mail and was now openly staring from her front yard. "Afternoon, Margaret," I called, using her first name because this moment felt too important for Mrs. Henderson formality. "That's quite a car, Joanna," she called back. "Didn't know you were interested in such things." "Neither did I said honestly. Lena appeared from around the side of her house, garden gloves still on her hands, dirt smudged on her cheek. She stopped dead when she saw the Mustang, her mouth falling open slightly. "Oh my," she said quietly. "What, do you think?" She walked around the car slowly, the way I had in Frank's garage, taking in every detail. When she got to the front, she ran her fingers lightly over the chrome horse emblem on the grille. "I think," she said carefully, "that this is the most beautiful screw you I've ever seen." That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and my laptop, researching classic car insurance and maintenance schedules, and trying to absorb the reality of what I'd done. The Mustang sat in my driveway like a blue exclamation point, visible through the kitchen window every time I looked up from the screen. My phone sat silent on the table beside me. Still no word from Caleb. No explanation for his disappearance. No acknowledgement that he'd taken my savings and vanished. Part of me had expected some kind of crisis that would require my intervention by now. A call from a hospital or a jail or an angry business partner. But there was nothing. Just silence where my brother used to be. I found myself wondering if this was what it felt like to be free. Scary and exhilarating and slightly nauseating all at once. For 30 years, I'd organized my life around Caleb's needs and crises. Now, for the first time since our parents died, I had no idea what came next. The Mustang's keys sat on the counter where I'd placed them when I came inside, the chrome horse keychain catching the overhead light. Such a small thing to represent, such a massive change. Frank had given me a folder full of documentation, service records, restoration photos, the original window sticker from 1967. I flipped through it slowly, trying to absorb the history of this machine that was now mine. The original buyer had been a 24-year-old teacher named Susan Patterson, according to the sales paperwork. She'd ordered the car with specific options: rally pack gauges, styled steel wheels, and the 289 V8 engine. The window sticker showed a total price of $349.83, which seemed impossibly small until I remembered that was more than most people made in a year back then. I wondered what Susan's story had been. Had she been like me, making a statement about independence? Or had she simply wanted a beautiful car? The thought of this unknown woman choosing the same options, the same color, the same engine that now rumbled in my driveway, created an odd sense of connection across the decades. My laptop chimed with an email notification. The message was from my biggest client, a seed company in Iowa that provided steady work illustrating their catalogs. They were offering me a rush project, a complete set of illustrations for their spring supplement, due in 6 weeks. Good money, reliable work, the kind of project I would have accepted without question just a month ago. But as I stared at the email, I realized something had shifted. The prospect of spending the next 6 weeks bent over my workbench, creating detailed drawings of other people's flowers felt suddenly claustrophobic. I'd been illustrating other people's gardens for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to want to plant my own. I closed the laptop without responding to the email and walked to the window that overlooked my backyard. The space was mostly lawn with a few established flower beds along the fence line. Practical, low maintenance, nothing that would interfere with my work schedule. But looking at it now, I could imagine something different. Raised beds full of cutting flowers. A greenhouse where I could start seedlings. A workshop where I could arrange fresh bouquets instead of pressing dead ones. It would take money, of course. Money I no longer had because I'd given it to Caleb and then spent the same amount on a car. I didn't know how to drive properly. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the only way to break a 30-year pattern was to make choices that didn't leave room for backsliding. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Marcus Quinn's number. Marcus ran the local auto shop, and I'd met him last year when my Honda needed brake work. He was the kind of man who actually listened when you talked, who fixed what was broken without trying to sell you things you didn't need. If anyone could help me learn to properly care for a classic car, it would be Marcus. The phone rang 3 times before his familiar voice answered. Quinn's Auto. This is Marcus. Hi, Marcus. This is Joanna Briggs. You worked on my Honda last year? Sure, I remember. What can I do for you? I just bought a 1967 Mustang Fastback, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. A pause. Well, that's honest. What kind of help are you looking for? Everything. How to maintain it, how to drive it properly, how to keep it from eating my life savings in repair bills. Marcus chuckled. Sounds like you need the full classic car education package. Why don't you bring her by tomorrow and we'll take a look? I can give you a rundown on what to watch for and set up a maintenance schedule. That would be amazing, thank you. No problem. Fair warning, though. Once you start down the classic car road, it's hard to stop. They get in your blood. After I hung up, I walked outside to look at the Mustang one more time before bed. The streetlight cast long shadows across its hood, and I could smell the faint scent of motor oil and old leather that seemed to emanate from classic cars. I thought about Caleb, probably hundreds of miles away by now, completely unaware that I'd just bought the car he'd dreamed about his entire adult life. Part of me wondered what he'd think when he found out. Would he be angry? Hurt? Would he even care? But for the first time in 3 decades, what my brother thought wasn't the most important factor in my decision-making process. I'd bought this car for me, with money that was mine, because I wanted something beautiful and powerful and completely impractical in my life. Standing there in my driveway at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, running my hand over the smooth curve of the Mustang's fender, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was 22 years old, and anything seemed possible. I felt like myself again. The phone rang at 6:30 Monday morning, jolting me, awake from a dream where I was racing the Mustang down an endless country road. For a moment, my heart leaped with the old familiar panic. Surely this was Caleb calling with some crisis that required immediate attention. But when I squinted, at the display, it was just my mother's oldest friend, Betty Kowalski, probably calling to verify the rumors about my car purchase. "Morning, Betty," I said, trying to sound more awake than I felt. "Joanna, dear, I hope I didn't wake you. I was just calling to see if it's true about the Mustang." News traveled fast in Millbrook. "It's true." "Well, good for you. Harold always said you had more steel in your spine than you let on. God rest his soul, but he had good instincts about people. Betty's husband had died 2 years ago, and she had a way of invoking his memory that made it seem like he was still offering commentary on current events from wherever retired hardware store owners went when they passed on." "Thank you, Betty. That means a lot." "Margaret Henderson said it's the most beautiful car she's ever seen. And you know, Margaret doesn't hand out compliments easily. What made you decide to buy it?" I'd been getting variations of this question all weekend from neighbors and the grocery store clerk and the woman who delivered my mail. Everyone wanted to know what had prompted sensible Joanna Briggs to suddenly buy a muscle car. "Sometimes you just need to do something different," I said, which was becoming my standard response. "Well, different can be good, especially when you've been doing the same thing for too long." Betty's voice carried the weight of experience. "Harold used to say that the biggest risk in life is not taking any risks at all." After I hung up, I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the Mustang. In the morning light, it looked even more dramatic, like a piece of sculpture that had accidentally been designed for transportation. I'd arranged to take it to Marcus's shop that afternoon, but first I needed to practice driving it around town. The manual transmission was still intimidating. Frank had been patient with his instruction, but muscle memory took time to develop. I'd stalled it twice just backing out of the driveway yesterday, much to Mrs. Henderson's obvious amusement. My laptop sat on the kitchen table, still displaying the unanswered email from the seed company. The deadline for responding was today, and I knew they'd find another illustrator if I didn't get back to them soon. It was exactly the kind of steady work I'd built my career on. Reliable, well-paying, creatively satisfying in a modest way. But as I read through the project details again, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Frank Morrison. He'd spent 15 years restoring the Mustang, working on it every weekend, pouring his attention and skill into bringing something beautiful back to life. At the end, he had a machine that was better than new, something that would outlast him and bring joy to whoever came after. My illustration work felt different in comparison. Static, preserved, beautiful in its way, but removed from the living, growing reality of the plants I was documenting. I'd been pressing flowers for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to watch them bloom. Before I could second-guess myself, I typed a polite decline to the seed company, thanking them for thinking of me and suggesting another illustrator who could handle the project. Then I closed the laptop and walked outside to practice driving. The Mustang started with a rumble that seemed to wake up every dog in a 3-block radius. I'd forgotten how loud it was compared to my Honda. This wasn't a car you could drive discreetly. It announced itself, demanded attention, refused to blend into the background. I drove slowly through Millbrook's quiet streets, getting a feel for the clutch and the steering, the way the car responded to throttle input. It was like learning a new language, one spoken in revolutions per minute and gear ratios instead of words. At the town's only traffic light, I stopped beside a young man in a lifted pickup truck who was staring at the Mustang with obvious appreciation. When the light turned green, he gave me a thumbs up and shouted, "Nice ride," before accelerating away. It was a small thing, but it made me smile. When was the last time a stranger had complimented something I owned? When was the last time I'd owned something worth complimenting? Marcus's shop sat on the edge of town, a collection of low buildings surrounded by cars in various stages of repair. I'd been here once before with my Honda, and I remembered being impressed by how clean and organized everything was. Some auto shops felt chaotic, but Marcus ran his with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. He was waiting for me in the parking lot when I pulled up, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Marcus was probably in his early 50s, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending time outdoors and the steady hands that came from 30 years of fixing things. "So this is the famous Mustang," he said, walking around the car, with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen thousands of engines and transmissions and brake systems. "Frank Morrison's car? You know Frank? Know his work. He brought this in for inspection a couple years ago when he was getting ready to sell. Beautiful restoration." Marcus popped the hood and peered at the engine. "He did everything right. This should give you years of reliable driving if you take care of it properly." That's what I'm hoping to learn. For the next hour, Marcus walked me through the basics of classic car ownership. How to check the oil and transmission fluid. How to identify potential problems before they became expensive repairs. How to warm up the engine properly, and why it mattered. How to store the car during winter months. The thing about old cars, he said, demonstrating how to check the carburetor linkage, is that they need attention. Not constant crisis management, but regular maintenance. They reward care with reliability. There was something about the way he said it that made me think he wasn't just talking about cars. "Want to take it for a drive?" he asked. "I can give you some tips on driving manual transmission." We spent another hour on quiet country roads, with Marcus patiently coaching me through proper shifting technique and clutch engagement. He had a teacher's instinct for knowing when to offer guidance and when to let me figure things out myself. "You're a natural," he said as we pulled back into his shop. Frank taught you well." I was terrified I'd destroy the transmission. Cars are tougher than people think. This one especially. The 289 is bulletproof if you don't abuse it, and Frank rebuilt everything to better than new specifications. Marcus paused, studying my face. "Can I ask what made you choose this particular car?" I'd been getting that question a lot, but something about Marcus made me want to give him a real answer. My brother has wanted this exact car since he was 18. Same year, same color, same engine. He used to print out pictures from the internet and talk about buying one someday. I ran my hand along the car's fender. Last month, he asked me for money for another business venture. $23,000. Everything I had saved. "And you gave it to him?" "I gave it to him. Then he disappeared." I looked at Marcus, directly. "So I used the same amount of money to buy his dream car for myself." Marcus nodded slowly. "Sounds like you're done being the backup plan." "Something like that." "Good for you. Life's too short to spend it waiting for other people to get their act together." That evening I sat in my sunroom with a cup of tea and a stack of gardening catalogs I'd been accumulating for months. With my laptop closed and no illustration deadlines looming, I had time to really look at them, to imagine what I could grow instead of just documenting what other people had grown. The catalogs were full of possibilities. Heirloom tomatoes and cutting flowers, herb gardens and ornamental grasses. I found myself dog-earing pages making lists, planning gardens that existed only in my imagination but felt more real than anything I'd worked on in years. My phone buzzed with a text message, and again my heart jumped with the automatic hope that it might be Caleb. But it was from Lena. "Saw you driving around town today. You looked happy." I typed back, "Learning." "Good. Want company for dinner?" I made too much lasagna. Always. Lena arrived 20 minutes later with a casserole dish and a bottle of wine that was probably too expensive for a Tuesday night, but exactly right for celebrating small victories. "So," she said, settling into her usual chair at my kitchen table, "how does it feel to be a classic car owner?" Terrifying. Exhilarating. Like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not. Or maybe you're finally being someone you are. We ate lasagna and drank wine and talked about everything, except Caleb's absence. Lena told me about her latest project, converting part of her backyard into a butterfly garden. I told her about declining the illustration project and spending the afternoon learning about carburetors. "You know what I realized today?" I said as we finished the bottle of wine. "I've been living like I'm in rehearsal for my real life. Like someday the curtain will go up and then I'll start being the person I'm supposed to be. And now I think maybe this is it. This is my life. And if I want it to be different, I have to make it different." Lena raised her empty wineglass in a mock toast. "To making it different. To making it different." After she left, I walked outside to check on the Mustang one more time before bed. It was becoming a ritual, this evening inspection, like saying goodnight to something precious. The car sat quietly in my driveway, its chrome gleaming under the streetlight. In just a few days, it had already started to feel like it belonged, here like it had always been part of my life. I thought about Caleb wherever he was. Did he even know I'd been trying to call him? Did he care that he disappeared without explanation, leaving me to wonder if he was safe or in trouble, or simply done with our family dynamic? Part of me still expected him to show up with some crisis that would require my intervention, some explanation that would make everything make sense. But another part of me, a part that was growing stronger every day, hoped he wouldn't. For the first time in 30 years, I was discovering who I was, when I wasn't defined by my role as Caleb's safety net, and I was starting to like the person I was finding. My phone sat silent on the kitchen counter. No missed calls or urgent messages. The quiet felt different now. Not empty, but full of potential. Full of choices that were mine to make. I locked the front door and turned off the lights, leaving the Mustang to keep watch over a life that was finally beginning to feel like my own. 3 weeks after buying the Mustang, I was becoming someone I barely recognized. The woman who had spent decades organizing her life around caution and responsibility was driving to farmers' markets in a muscle car, buying heirloom seeds and heritage plants with money from illustration projects I was actually excited about. The transformation had started small. Instead of accepting every commission that came my way, I'd begun choosing projects that genuinely interested me. A local organic farm wanted illustrations for their seed packets. A botanical garden needed drawings. For their educational materials, a small press was publishing a book about native prairie plants and needed detailed artwork. The work paid less than the big catalog projects, but it fed something in me that had been starving for years. I was drawing living gardens instead of sterile specimens, working with people who shared my passion for growing things rather than just documenting them. "You look different," Lena observed on a Thursday morning, finding me in my sunroom, arranging fresh flowers I'd bought at the market, instead of pressing dead ones for preservation. "Younger." "I feel different," I admitted, adjusting the stems. In a mason jar, the flowers were nothing special. Grocery store daisies and some Queen Anne's lace I'd gathered from the roadside. But they brought life to my workspace in a way my preserved specimens never had. "Any word from Caleb?" It had been 5 weeks since he'd disappeared with my money, and the question no longer sent my heart racing with worry. "No, and I'm starting to be okay with that." Lena smiled. "Good. You've been carrying that boy for 30 years. Time for him to learn to walk on his own." That afternoon, I had an appointment with a potential client who'd found my work through the Organic Farm Project. Sarah Chen owned a small nursery outside town and was launching a line of specialty herb blends. She wanted original botanical illustrations for the packaging, something that would set her products apart from the mass-produced alternatives. I drove the Mustang to our meeting, still self-conscious about the attention it drew, but growing more comfortable with being seen. The car had become a conversation starter, a way for strangers to connect with me. People would stop me at gas stations to ask about the restoration, share stories about cars they'd owned or wished they'd kept, offer unsolicited advice about maintenance and modifications. Sarah's nursery was hidden down a gravel road, marked only by a hand-painted sign that read, "Moonrise Herbs and Plants." The property sprawled across several acres with greenhouse structures and garden beds laid out in organized abundance. It was the kind of place I'd dreamed about creating, but never had the courage to attempt. "You must be Joanna," Sarah said, walking up to the Mustang as I climbed out. She was younger than me, maybe early 40s, with dirt under her fingernails and the kind of tan that came from working outdoors year-round. "That's some car." "Thank you. It's a recent addition to my life. The best ones usually are. Come on, let me show you around." For the next hour, Sarah walked me through her operation, explaining her philosophy of sustainable growing and her vision for the packaging project. She wanted illustrations that captured not just the appearance of the herbs, but their essential character. The way chamomile flowers open to the morning sun, how basil leaves release their fragrance when touched. "Most commercial herb packaging looks sterile," she said, crushing a sprig of rosemary between her fingers and holding it out for me to smell. "I want people to feel like they're connecting with the actual plants, not just buying dried leaves in a package." We spent another hour in her studio, looking through my portfolio and discussing timelines. The project would take 3 months and pay enough to cover my expenses while leaving time for other work. More importantly, it felt like the kind of collaboration I'd been missing. Working with someone who understood that plants were living beings with personalities and preferences, not just subjects for documentation. "I have to ask," Sarah said as we shook hands to close the deal. "What made you choose botanical illustration? It's not exactly a common career path." "It chose me, I think. I was supposed to go to art school, but my parents died and I needed to come home and take care of my younger brother. Botanical work was something I could do from home, on my own schedule, around his needs. And now?" I considered the question. "Now I'm learning to work around my own needs instead." The drive home took me past the empty storefront that had housed my flower shop dreams. For months I'd driven by this space every few days, imagining how I'd arrange the displays, where I'd put the register, how I'd design the workspace in the back. The for-lease sign was still in the window, but looking at it now, I felt curiosity instead of longing. On impulse, I pulled into the parking space in front and got out to peer through the windows. The space was larger than I'd remembered, with good natural light and enough room for both retail displays and a working area. But instead of imagining flower arrangements and plant sales, I found myself picturing something different. An art studio with work tables for botanical illustration, display space for finished pieces, maybe even classes for other people interested in learning the craft. The idea felt audacious and impractical, and absolutely right. I was still standing there, lost in possibilities, when someone tapped me on the shoulder. "Thinking about renting?" I turned to find Marcus Quinn behind me, wearing work clothes and carrying a coffee cup from the diner down the street. "Maybe. I don't know. Just looking." "It's a good space. Tom Bradley owned the print shop here for 20 years before he retired. Good bones, reasonable rent." Marcus studied my face. "What would you do with it?" "I'm not sure yet. Maybe an art studio. A place to teach botanical illustration." The words felt strange in my mouth, too bold and presumptuous for someone who'd spent her career working quietly at her kitchen table. "Sounds perfect for you. You think so?" "I think you've been hiding your light under a bushel for too long," Marcus smiled. "Besides, this town could use more beautiful things." That evening, I sat in my sunroom with a legal pad, sketching out possibilities, not detailed business plans. I wasn't ready for that level of commitment, but rough ideas for how the space might work. Teaching space in the front, with natural light for drawing, storage for supplies and reference materials, display areas for finished work and maybe pieces by other local artists. The more I wrote, the more excited I became. I'd never taught before, but I'd been learning botanical illustration techniques for 30 years. Surely that knowledge was worth sharing. And Millbrook was full of people who might be interested in learning. Retirees looking for creative outlets, young mothers wanting something just for themselves, even teenagers who might discover a passion for art through nature study. My phone rang, interrupting my planning. The display showed a number I didn't recognize with a local area code. "Hello. Joanna, it's Marcus. I hope it's not too late to call." "Not at all. What's up?" "I was talking to my friend who owns that building downtown. He said if you're serious about looking at the space, he could show it to you tomorrow." My heart started beating faster. "That's very nice of him, but I'm not sure I'm ready." Sometimes ready is something you become by doing, not something you wait to feel. The wisdom in that statement stopped my automatic deflection. How many opportunities had I missed over the years by waiting to feel ready? "What time?" I asked. 10 o'clock, if that works for you." After I hung up, I walked outside to look at the Mustang. 6 weeks ago, I'd never imagined myself owning a classic car, and now I couldn't picture my life without it. Maybe renting a studio space would be the same kind of leap. Terrifying in prospect, but natural in reality. The night was warm, for October, with a harvest moon hanging low over the cornfields that surrounded Millbrook. I could smell wood smoke from someone's fireplace and the faint scent of dying leaves that meant winter was coming. Soon I'd have to make arrangements for storing the Mustang through the cold months. Marcus had offered space in his heated garage, and I'd probably take him up on it. The thought of winter made me realize how much my daily routines had changed since buying the car. I looked forward to driving now, planned routes that would take me past interesting scenery, found excuses to make trips that would have seemed frivolous before. The Mustang had given me permission to take up space in the world, to be seen and heard and noticed. Maybe a studio would do the same thing for my work. Instead of hiding in my sunroom, creating illustrations that disappeared into catalogs and educational materials, I could have a space where people could see the process, where my art could be part of the community instead of separate from it. My phone buzzed with a text message. For just a moment, the old anxiety flickered, still hoping for word from Caleb, still carrying the habit of worry even though I no longer needed it. But the message was from Sarah Chen. Looking forward to working together. Attached are some photos of the herbs we'll be featuring. I scrolled through the images. Close-ups of lavender and thyme, rosemary and sage, all photographed with the kind of attention that revealed their individual character. This was exactly the kind of work I wanted to be doing. Collaboration with people who understood that art and life weren't separate things. Back inside, I opened my laptop and began researching commercial lease agreements and small business permits. The practical side of my brain listed all the reasons why renting a studio was impractical. The overhead costs, the uncertainty of teaching income, the risk of failure in a small town that might not have enough interested students. But the part of me that had bought a Mustang on impulse, that had declined safe illustration projects in favor of more interesting ones, that had spent 30 years playing it safe and was finally ready to take some risks. That part of me was already imagining the first drawing class, the satisfaction of watching someone discover they could create something beautiful with their own hands. I stayed up until midnight, making lists and calculations, researching art supply vendors and insurance requirements. By the time I finally went to bed, I had filled 8 pages with notes and ideas. The last thing I did before turning off the lights was look out at the Mustang, still gleaming under the streetlight. 6 weeks ago, I would never have imagined that buying a car could change the trajectory of a life. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the most important changes always started with something that seemed unrelated to the real issue. I'd bought the car because I was angry at Caleb for disappearing with my money. But what I'd really bought was permission to want things for myself, to make choices based on my own desires instead of other people's needs. Tomorrow I would look at a studio space that might become the foundation for a completely different kind of life. And for the first time in 30 years, I was more excited than afraid about what came next. The studio space was perfect. High ceilings, north-facing windows, enough room for a dozen students with space left over for displays and storage. Tom Bradley's friend, a soft-spoken man named David Kim, walked me through the space with the patience of someone who understood that big decisions needed time to percolate. Tom left it in good shape, David said, flipping switches to demonstrate that all the electrical systems worked. He was meticulous about maintenance. New HVAC system 3 years ago, fresh paint last spring. I stood in the center of the main room, trying to imagine it filled with easels and drawing tables. Students bent over botanical specimens with intense concentration. The afternoon light streaming through the windows would be perfect for detail. Work and the hardwood floors had the kind of character that came from decades of creative use. "What's the rent?" I asked, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. $800 a month, plus utilities. First and last month up front, 1-year lease minimum. It was more than I'd been hoping, but less than I'd feared. With the Sarah Chen project and a few other commissions, I could probably make it work. The question wasn't whether I could afford it. It was whether I was brave enough to try. "Can I have a few days to think about it?" "Of course, but I should mention there's another party interested. Local woman wants to open a craft store." The competition should have made me more cautious, but instead it sparked something fierce and protective in my chest. This space was meant for art, for teaching, for the kind of work that fed souls instead of just filling time. "I'll have an answer for you by Friday," I said. I was walking back to the Mustang, my mind spinning with possibilities and logistics, when I saw a familiar figure coming out of the diner across the street. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then reality crashed over me like cold water. Caleb! He looked terrible. Thinner than when I'd seen him 6 weeks ago, wearing clothes that looked like he'd slept in them, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who was either injured or exhausted or both. But it was definitely my brother, standing on the sidewalk of our hometown like he'd never left. Our eyes met across the street, and I watched a series of emotions play across his face. Surprise, guilt, something that might have been relief. He started walking toward me, and I found myself frozen beside the Mustang, my hand on the door handle. "Joe," he said when he reached me. His voice was hoarse, and up close I could see that he'd lost more weight than I'd realized. "I was just coming to see you." "Were you?" I surprised myself with how calm I sounded. "That's interesting, considering you disappeared 6 weeks ago without a word." He had the grace to look ashamed. "I know. I'm sorry. Things got complicated." "Things always get complicated with you, Caleb." He noticed the Mustang then, his eyes widening as he took in the familiar lines and chrome details. I watched him process what he was seeing. The exact car he'd dreamed about since high school, parked in downtown Millbrook with my keys in my hand. Where did this come from?" "I bought it." "You bought a Mustang?" He walked around the car slowly, the way I had in Frank Morrison's garage. "This is a 67 Fastback, Rally Pack, 289 and V8. His voice held a mixture of awe and something else I couldn't identify. "I know what it is." "Joe, this is my dream car. This is the exact car I've wanted since I was 18 years old. I know that too." He stopped walking and looked at me directly. "How much did this cost?" I could see him doing the math, could watch the moment when he realized the connection between his disappearance and my purchase. $23,000, I said quietly. The color drained from his face. "Joe, no. Tell me you didn't..." "Didn't what? Use my own money to buy something I wanted?" "That was supposed to be for the restaurant. You said you'd loan it to me. I did loan it to you. Then you disappeared. So I spent the same amount on something for myself." I opened the car door, suddenly wanting to be anywhere but having this conversation in the middle of Main Street. "Where have you been, Caleb?" "It's complicated. It's always complicated. Try me." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from childhood when he was trying to figure out how to explain away some transgression. "The restaurant deal fell through. The investor pulled out at the last minute. Said the numbers didn't work. I was stuck with commitments I couldn't meet, people I owed money to. He looked up at me with those eyes that had been getting him out of trouble his entire life. I had to use your money to cover debts, Joe. I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice. You could have called me. You could have explained what was happening instead of just vanishing. I was embarrassed, ashamed. I knew you'd be disappointed. In me again. So instead you let me worry for 6 weeks, wondering if you were dead in a ditch somewhere. I was going to call... When? When were you going to call, Caleb? After you figured out another scheme to pay me back? After you found another investor for another restaurant that was going to solve all your problems? He looked genuinely stricken, and for a moment I felt the old familiar urge to comfort him, to make this easier. But then I remembered the studio, space, the botanical illustration projects, the new life I'd been building in his absence. Where have you been? I asked again. Chicago, mostly. Staying with some friends, trying to figure out how to make this right. And what did you figure out? That I need help, real help. Not just money, but... He gestured helplessly. I don't know how to do this, Joe. I don't know how to be a responsible adult. I've been relying on you to bail me out for so long that I never learned how to handle things when they go wrong. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years, and it should have made me feel vindicated. Instead, I just felt tired. I can't be your safety net anymore, Caleb. I know. I'm not asking you to be. Seeing you with this car, knowing you spent the money I lost, it makes me realize how selfish I've been, how much I've taken from you, without giving anything back. A small crowd was starting to gather across the street. Millbrook was the kind of town where siblings having an intense conversation beside a classic car constituted entertainment. We can't do this here, I said. Get in. Caleb climbed into the passenger seat and I started the engine. The familiar rumble seemed to emphasize the strangeness of the situation. My brother, who had dreamed about this car his entire adult life, sitting beside me while I drove the machine he would never be able to afford. I drove us to the lake on the edge of town, a small body of water surrounded by cornfields and a few scattered picnic tables. It was where we used to come as kids when we needed to talk without adult supervision. Nice car, Caleb said after I parked facing the water. Thank you. Manual transmission? Yes. You learned stick shift? I learned a lot of things after you left. We sat in silence for a while, watching a great blue heron fishing in the shallows. The afternoon sun slanted through the windshield, and I could smell the autumn air mixed with the car's leather interior. I'm getting help, Caleb said finally. Real help. There's a program in Springfield for people with gambling problems. That stopped me cold. Gambling problems? The restaurant money didn't go to debts, Joe. Not the way I told you. Most of it went to a poker game in Chicago. High stakes. I thought I could win enough to pay you back and still fund the restaurant. He laughed bitterly. Classic gambler thinking. Double down when you're behind. How long? I asked quietly. How long have I been gambling? Since college. How long has it been a problem? Since college. How long have I been lying to you about it? Since college. I felt like the world had tilted sideways. 30 years of failed businesses, of loans that were never repaid, of schemes that always collapsed at the last minute. How much of it had been gambling losses, disguised as entrepreneurial setbacks? The sports bar that failed when you were 32? Poker. Debts. The landscaping business? Borrowed against the equipment for a card game. Lost everything. The vintage car restoration shop. never existed. I rented a garage space and told everyone I was fixing cars. But I was spending all day at the riverboat casino. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. I'd spent decades believing in his dreams, funding his ambitions, making sacrifices so he could pursue opportunities that had never been real. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm tired of lying. Because seeing you with this car made me realize what I've stolen from you. Not just money, time, energy, dreams. You could have opened your flower shop years ago if you hadn't been supporting my addiction. What do you want from me, Caleb? Nothing. That's the point. I'm not here to ask for more money, or another chance, or forgiveness I don't deserve. I'm here to tell you the truth, and to say that I'm sorry, and to ask you not to give up on the flower shop because of me. I'm not opening a flower shop, I said. But you said, I said I'd been saving money for a flower shop. That was before. Now I'm thinking about renting a studio space downtown, teaching botanical illustration. He looked at me with genuine surprise. Teaching? Why not? I've been doing this work for 30 years. Maybe it's time to share what I've learned. That sounds amazing, Joe. Really amazing. He paused. I'm proud of you. Don't. Don't what? Don't be proud of me for finally doing something with my life. Don't act like this is some kind of victory we're sharing. I bought this car and I'm considering the studio because you disappeared. Because for the first time in 30 years, I had to figure out who I was when I wasn't cleaning up your messes. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they needed to be said. You're right, Caleb said quietly. I'm sorry. We sat in the car for another hour, talking in fits and starts about the past 30 years, about patterns and enabling, and the difference between helping and harming. Caleb told me about the gambling program, about the counselor who'd helped him understand that his addiction had cost him more than money. It had cost him any chance of a real relationship with the one person who'd never given up on him. I don't expect forgiveness, he said as the sun started to set. I don't expect anything, but I want you to know that I'm going to get clean, and I'm going to stay clean, whether you're in my life or not. Good, I said, because I can't be in your life the way I was before. I won't be. I understand. As I drove him back to town, I found myself thinking about this studio space, about the choice I needed to make by Friday. 6 weeks ago, I would have let Caleb's crisis derail my plans. I would have focused on helping him instead of pursuing my own dreams. But sitting beside him in the car he'd always wanted and would never own, I realized that the biggest gift I could give both of us was to stop rescuing him from the consequences of his choices. Where are you staying? I asked as we pulled up to the diner. Motel 6 outside town. I've got a room for a few days while I figure out next steps. Call me when you start the program, I said. Not before. He nodded and climbed out of the car, then leaned down to the window. The car suits you, Joe. It really does. I watched him walk into the diner, his shoulders bent with exhaustion and shame and something that might have been relief. Then I drove. Home. Past the studio space that was going to be mine. Past the life I was finally ready to claim. I called David Kim first thing Friday morning and told him I wanted the studio space. The words came out steadier than I felt, but once I said them, a sense of rightness settled over me like warm sunlight. Excellent, David said. Can you come in this afternoon to sign the papers? I'll be there at 2. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, making lists of everything I'd need. Art supplies, easels, tables, chairs, botanical reference books. The initial investment would be substantial. But I had money coming in from the Sarah Chen project and 2 other commissions. More importantly, I had something I'd never had before. Complete certainty I was making the right choice. Lena found me 2 hours later, still surrounded by planning notes. "You look like a woman with a mission," she said. "I rented the studio." "The one downtown? Joanna, that's wonderful." She leaned in to see my sketches. "When do you start?" "November 1st. That gives me 3 weeks to get everything ready." I showed her the floor plan. Teaching space in the front, storage in the back, display area along the east wall. What about students? It was a practical question I'd been avoiding. "I thought I'd start with a few classes, advertise in the paper, maybe flyers at the library. Why not start with people you know? I'd love to learn botanical illustration, and Margaret Henderson's been looking for something to do since she retired." The idea of teaching Mrs. Henderson was both terrifying and perfect. "You really think there's interest? This town is full of people hungry for something beautiful to do with their time. You'll have more students than you know what to do with." That afternoon, I signed a 1-year lease, handed over first and last month's rent, and received the keys. David Kim walked me through the space again, pointing out outlets and explaining the heating system. "Tom left some furniture in the back room," he said. "You're welcome to it." Inside, I found sturdy wooden tables, metal filing cabinets, and vintage drafting stools. Perfect for classes. "This is incredible," I said. Tom hoped the next tenant could use it. He believed in supporting other people's creative work. I spent the rest of the afternoon measuring, listing what to buy, and what I could repurpose. The space felt different now. Not just a place I was visiting, but one where I would build something new. On the way home, I stopped at Marcus's shop to tell him about the studio and arrange for winter storage for the Mustang. He was elbows deep in a transmission but stopped when I walked in. "I heard you rented Tom Bradley's old place," he said. "News travels fast." David Kim told his wife, who told Betty Kowalski, who told everyone since lunch. I should get used to being local news. Could be worse. Last week everyone was talking about the Hendersons' cat stuck in a chimney. He grinned. "When do you open?" "Hopefully by Thanksgiving. Classes maybe in the new year. And the Mustang. I'd like to take you up on your garage offer. I'll pay. Don't worry about money. I've got space, and it'll be nice to look at something beautiful this winter." He paused. "How are you feeling about everything? The studio, your brother showing up?" I'd told Marcus about Caleb's return and the gambling addiction. It was a relief to talk to someone without 30 years of history, coloring their view. Scared about the studio. Relieved about Caleb. Relieved because I finally know the truth. All those years of failed ventures, at least now I understand. And now, he's checking into a program in Springfield. He says he doesn't expect anything from me, and I told him I can't be his safety net anymore. I looked at the Mustang. For the first time in my adult life, I get to find out who I am without his problems defining me. And who's that? Someone braver than I thought. Someone who's been hiding for too long. That evening, I drove to Springfield for supplies and furniture. The shopping felt like both a celebration and a commitment. Every easel and drawing pad was a vote of confidence in the life I was building. I found myself in the automotive section, staring at car care products. The idea of not driving the Mustang for 4 months felt wrong, but Marcus had explained how important it was. "Beautiful car," said a voice behind me. I turned to see an elderly woman admiring the Mustang through the window. My late husband had one just like it. It's a wonderful car, I said. I just bought it. Good for you. Harold always said life's too short to drive boring cars. She smiled. Most women our age play it safe. I'm learning not to. It shows. You've got the look of someone who's finally figured out what she wants. Driving home, I kept thinking about her words. Did I look different? I felt different. My routines had changed. Instead of hiding in my sunroom, I was out in a car that drew stares. Instead of accepting work that paid, I was choosing work that moved me. Instead of organizing life around Caleb's needs, I was making plans for myself. The biggest change was internal. I was taking up space in the world, being seen, heard, noticed. For 30 years, I'd lived like a background character in someone else's story. Now I was writing my own. My phone rang as I unloaded supplies. Sarah Chen's number lit up. Hi, Sarah. Hi, Joanna. I hope I'm not calling too late. I just heard the most interesting news from David Kim. Small towns. About the studio. Congratulations. That's exciting. I was calling about the herb illustrations, but now I'm even more excited. An art teacher who understands plants. My customers will love that. We spent 20 minutes discussing her vision. She'd been thinking about workshops at the nursery. I'd love that, I said. Still figuring out the teaching side, but working with live plants sounds incredible. Let's plan something for spring, when things are blooming and people are thinking gardens. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen surrounded by supplies and planning notes. A year-long lease. Students depending on me. Collaborations forming for ourselves. Someone who'd played it safe most of her life, I was suddenly taking real risks. But it felt right, in a way nothing had in years. I was building something that reflected my skills and values. No one could take it or twist it into something unrecognizable. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't recognize the number. Hello? Joe? It's Caleb. My heart did its old lurch, but fainter now. More habit than panic. How are you? I'm at the treatment center. Started the program today. His voice sounded different, clearer, less full of charm and evasion. I wanted to let you know. How is it? Hard, but good. The counselor says I used gambling to avoid dealing with grief over Mom and Dad. It made sense. 30 years too late, but still. I'm glad you're getting help. I heard about the studio. Mrs. Henderson called the center. Lena gave her the number. She wants to sign up for your class. I couldn't help smiling. I haven't even opened yet. Well, you know how it is. Everyone wants in on the next big thing. He paused. I'm proud of you. I know I don't have the right to say that, but I am. Thank you. I'll be here for 90 days, then transitional housing. I've got to learn how to live without gambling first. That sounds wise. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know I'm trying. For me. But also because you deserve a brother who isn't a constant crisis. After he hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand. There was something new in his voice. Maybe the program was working. Maybe he was ready to change. But for the first time, it didn't matter. Whether Caleb got better or not, my life would continue. The studio would open. I would teach. I would build something beautiful and lasting that had nothing to do with rescuing anyone. I looked out at the Mustang, gleaming under the streetlight. Soon it would go into storage. But come spring, I'd be driving it to my own studio, to teach classes I designed, to students who chose to learn from me. It was a future I never imagined, built on choices I never thought I'd make. But maybe bravery wasn't about being ready. Maybe it was about acting despite fear, about believing your dreams deserve as much space as anyone else's. The studio key sat on the table beside me, ready to unlock a life that was finally, completely mine. The studio was almost ready. 3 weeks of painting, organizing, and furniture arranging had transformed Tom Bradley's old print shop into something that looked like an artist's dream. Natural light streamed through the north-facing windows, illuminating the 12 drawing stations I'd set up with easels and stools. The walls displayed botanical prints from my own collection, alongside reference charts showing leaf shapes and flower structures. I stood in the center of the space on a cold November morning, checking items off my opening day list. Fresh flowers, in mason jars on each table. Check. Reference books arranged on the shelves. Check. Art supplies organized in bins by drawing station. Check. Coffee maker ready in the small kitchen area Tom had used for his printing business. Check. Tomorrow was my first official class. Introduction to Botanical Illustration. With 8 brave souls who'd signed up based on nothing more than a small ad in the local paper, and enthusiastic word of mouth from Lena. Mrs. Henderson had indeed been the first to register, followed by Sarah Chen, 2 retired teachers, a young mother looking for creative outlet, a teenager whose grandmother had bought her, the class as an early Christmas gift, and Marcus Quinn, who'd surprised me by asking if men were welcome. Of course, men are welcome, I'd told him. Some of the greatest botanical artists in history were men. Good, because I've always been curious about how you capture all those tiny details. The bell above the front door chimed, and I looked up to see Lena entering with a cardboard box in her arms. "Delivery," she announced, "from the bakery." I didn't order anything from the bakery. I did. Opening day calls for pastries. She set the box on my desk and opened it to reveal an assortment of muffins, scones, and Danish pastries. "Consider it a studio warming gift. Lena, you didn't have to—" "Yes, I did. You're about to become Millbrook's first art teacher in probably 50 years. That deserves celebration." I'd been so focused on the practical details of opening the studio that I hadn't stopped to consider the historic significance of what I was doing. But Lena was right. This was something new for our small town, something that would outlast me, and hopefully inspire other people to take similar creative risks. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Lena asked, settling into one of the student chairs and looking around the space with obvious satisfaction. "As ready as I'll ever be. I have the lesson plan worked out, specimens selected, all the supplies organized." I paused. "I'm terrified." "Good. Terror means you care about doing it right." The morning flew by as I made final preparations and ran through my lesson plan one more time. I decided to start with simple leaf studies, teaching basic observation and measurement techniques before moving on to more complex flower structures. The goal was to build confidence while introducing the fundamental skills that made botanical illustration different from other forms of art. At noon, I locked up the studio and drove home for lunch, taking the long way past the lake, where Caleb and I had talked 6 weeks earlier. The trees were bare now, their branches creating delicate patterns against the gray November sky. Winter was coming, and soon the Mustang would go into storage until spring. Marcus had offered to pick up the car this weekend, and I'd reluctantly agreed. The practical part of me understood the necessity of protecting a classic car from salt and cold, but I was going to miss the daily ritual of driving something beautiful and powerful. My phone rang as I was heating soup for lunch. The caller ID showed Caleb's name, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, though it was fainter now than it used to be. "Hi, Caleb." Hey, Joe. How's the studio coming? Good. I open tomorrow. That's amazing. I wish I could be there. How's the program going? Hard but good. Really good, actually. I'm starting to understand things about myself that I never saw before. His voice carried a steadiness I hadn't heard in years. Listen, I wanted to tell you something. I've been working with my counselor on making amends to people I've hurt, and I know that starts with you. I set down my soup spoon, suddenly not hungry. Caleb, let me say this, please. I've calculated how much money I borrowed from you over the years. Real calculations, not estimates. It's more than $60,000, Joe. $60,000 that you could have used for your own dreams instead of funding my addiction. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd known it was substantial, but hearing the actual figure made the scope of my enabling impossible to ignore. I can't pay you back, he continued. Not the money. Maybe not ever. But I want you to know that I understand what I took from you, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make sure it meant something. What do you mean? I'm getting clean, really clean this time. Not because I owe it to you, but because the person who gave up $60,000 for her brother deserves a brother worth saving. I found myself crying, though I wasn't sure if it was from grief for all the lost years or relief that he finally understood the real cost of his addiction. I love you, Caleb, I said quietly. I always have. But I can't be responsible for your recovery. I know. That's the point. I'm responsible for it. But I wanted you to know that every day I stay clean is partly in honor of everything you sacrificed for me. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, processing the conversation. $60,000. It was more than I'd made in some years, more than I'd ever imagined accumulating. But it was also gone, invested in a relationship that had nearly cost me my own identity. The difference now was that I wasn't angry about it anymore. Sad, yes. Wistful about what might have been, certainly. But not angry. Anger required energy I was no longer willing to spend on the past. That afternoon, I made a final trip to the studio to ensure everything was perfect for tomorrow's class. The space felt ready, but I found myself second-guessing every decision. Were the chairs comfortable enough? Did I have enough reference materials? What if no one showed up? What if everyone showed up, but I turned out to be a terrible teacher? Was rearranging art supplies for the third time when the bell chimed and Marcus walked in. Thought you might want some company, he said, looking around the studio with obvious appreciation. This place looks incredible, Joanna. Thank you. I keep thinking I've forgotten something important. You know what you've forgotten? What? To trust yourself. You've been doing botanical illustration for 30 years. You know this subject better than anyone, within 100 miles. That doesn't mean I can teach it. Marcus walked over to one of my drawings displayed on the wall. A detailed study of a wild columbine that I'd completed last spring. You think you learned to draw like this by accident? No, but you learned it because you paid attention, because you practiced, because you cared about getting it right. Those are exactly the qualities that make a good teacher. He had a point, but I was still nervous about standing in front of a group and trying to explain techniques that had become second nature through years of practice. What if I can't explain how to see the way I see? What if I can't help them understand why botanical illustration is different from other kinds of art? Then you'll figure it out as you go. That's what good teachers do. They adapt, they learn from their students, they get better over time. Marcus smiled. Besides, you're not trying to create master artists in one class. You're just trying to help people see plants more clearly. We spent another hour in the studio, with Marcus asking questions about different techniques, and me finding myself explaining principles I'd never had to articulate before. By the time he left, I realized he'd just given me a preview of what teaching would be like: patient questions, thoughtful explanations, the satisfaction of sharing knowledge with someone genuinely interested in learning. That evening, I sat in my sunroom with a cup of tea and my pressed flower journal, looking through sketches I'd made over the years. Thousands of hours of careful observation, of learning to see the architecture of stems and the geometry of petals. All of that accumulated knowledge was about to find a new purpose. The Mustang sat in my driveway for what might be the last time, until spring. Tomorrow Marcus would drive it to his garage, where it would wait out the winter under a protective cover. The thought made me melancholy, but it also felt symbolic. I was storing away one phase of my transformation and preparing for the next. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen. "Can't wait for class tomorrow. I brought some herbs from the greenhouse for everyone to practice on." Then another from Mrs. Henderson. "What should I bring besides enthusiasm?" And another from the teenager Riley, whose grandmother had enrolled her. "Is it okay if I'm not very good at art?" Each message reminded me that 8 people were counting on me to give them something valuable. Not just instruction in botanical, illustration, but permission to see the world more carefully, to pay attention to details they might otherwise overlook, to create something beautiful with their own hands. I walked outside to say goodbye to the Mustang, running my hand along its smooth fender one last time. The car had been the catalyst for everything that followed. The studio, the new business relationships, the decision to stop enabling Caleb's addiction. It had given me permission to want things for myself, to take up space in the world, to make choices based on my own desires instead of other people's needs. But the real transformation had happened inside me, in the gradual recognition that I was worth investing in, that my dreams deserved as much attention as anyone else's problems. The car had been a symbol of that change, but the change itself was something I'd carried with me all along. Tomorrow I would walk into my own studio, stand in front of my first students, and begin teaching them to see the world the way I'd learned to see it, with patience and precision and wonder. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and exactly what I was meant to be doing. The November wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, the smell of one season ending and another beginning. I stood beside the car that had changed my life, looking at the studio space where I would continue that change, and felt something I'd been waiting 52 years to experience. I felt like I was finally home. 6 months later, I stood in my studio on a warm May morning, watching Riley Martinez, the teenager whose grandmother had enrolled her in my first class, put the finishing touches on a detailed drawing of a prairie rose. Her tongue peeked out in concentration as she shaded the delicate petals. "There," she said, sitting back. "What do you think, Miss Briggs?" "It's wonderful," I said. "You have a real gift for this work." Riley beamed. She'd started the class reluctantly, convinced she had no artistic talent, but botanical illustration suited her methodical mind. Now she was one of my most dedicated students, often staying late to work on personal projects. "Mrs. Henderson wants to know if you'll teach a summer intensive," Riley added, cleaning her tools with the careful precision I'd taught her. "She says she's learned more about plants in your class than in 40 years of gardening." The studio had exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Word of mouth brought new students faster than I could accommodate them. I was now running 3 regular classes and several specialized workshops. Sarah Chen and I had even hosted sold-out sessions, combining herb growing with illustration. The local community college had approached me about a continuing education program. "I'm thinking about it," I said. "But first I need to survive the spring plant sale." Sarah had proposed the plant sale, a fundraiser for the local library that blended her nursery expertise with my artistic touch. We'd grown heritage flowers and herbs from seed, and I'd made hand-illustrated plant markers. Early ticket sales suggested it would be a hit. The bell above the studio door chimed. Lena stepped in, carrying a cardboard box that clinked with glass. "Delivery from Moonrise Herbs," she announced. "Sarah wanted you to have these before the sale." Inside were mason jars filled with herb blends, each labeled with my botanical illustrations. Sarah had begun combining her products with my artwork, and the results were gallery-worthy. "These are gorgeous," Riley said, admiring a jar of lavender and chamomile. "You could sell them anywhere." If they do well locally, Sarah wants to expand into Chicago and Springfield. It was an unexpected development. My illustrations now appeared on packaging, educational materials, even a line of note cards commissioned by a Springfield gift shop. The work was profitable enough that I could be selective, choosing only the projects that inspired me. That morning class was one of my favorites. A small group of advanced students who'd been with me from the start. Mrs. Henderson had become a meticulous botanical artist. Marcus, to everyone's surprise, had developed a real talent for drawing woody stems. Even Lena had joined, claiming she needed a hobby that didn't involve dirt under her fingernails. "Today we're working with live specimens," I told them. Sarah brought in some unusual herbs. I distributed sprigs of lemon verbena, chocolate mint, and pineapple sage. Each one a challenge in scent, texture, and form. The students fell into a comfortable, focused silence, occasionally asking for feedback. This was what I loved most about teaching. Watching a student suddenly understand something they'd struggled with, catching a detail they'd previously missed. It was like watching them learn to see the world. Marcus looked up from his drawing. "How do you capture scent in a drawing?" "You can't, not directly, but you can draw the features that create scent. Oil glands, fine hairs on the stem. The goal is to be so precise that someone familiar with the plant could identify it from your drawing, even without color." At noon, I locked up and drove home for lunch, taking the scenic route past the lake where Caleb and I had talked in November. Trees were lush with new growth. It was hard to believe how much had changed in 6 months. The Mustang had come out of storage in March. I drove it to the studio every day now. It still drew attention, but no longer felt like a dramatic statement. It simply felt like mine. My phone rang as I pulled into the driveway. Caleb's name appeared. I answered without the knot of tension that used to come with his calls. "Hi, Caleb. How are you?" "Good. I finished the program last week." "Congratulations. How does it feel?" "Scary, but the good kind. Like standing at the edge of a diving board. You know you want to jump, but your stomach still flips." He'd completed his 90-day inpatient treatment and was now in transitional housing in Springfield, working as a maintenance assistant and attending group meetings. We'd kept in touch, careful, focused conversations about his recovery. "I'm staying in Springfield," he said. "Got a full-time job at the center. Not glamorous, but good work." "That sounds perfect. The counselors want me to stay near my support system, build something solid before I try to fix relationships. Is that what you want?" "Want a lot of things. I want to be your brother again. I want to pay back what I took. But I know this isn't about what I want. You've built something new, and I need to respect that." "I'd like to have a relationship again," I said. "But it has to be different. I can't be your safety net." "I don't want you to be. The person I'm becoming doesn't need a safety net. He needs a sister." He sounded different, quieter, steadier. For the first time in years, it felt like I was speaking to the real Caleb. Before we hung up, he said, "I heard about the plant sale. I'm proud of you, Joe. The studio, the teaching, all of it. You're doing exactly what you should be doing." That afternoon, I spent hours prepping the studio for the sale and finalizing the summer class schedule. The space had evolved. Student artwork lined the walls, a small library had grown with book donations, and a corner now featured botanical, prints and art supplies for sale. The success was gratifying, but it was the community that meant the most. People came to learn, but stayed to connect. Friendships had blossomed across generations and backgrounds, united by the patient art of observation. Sarah arrived just before closing with a van full of plants, and we arranged them in the front window. Heritage tomatoes, herbs, and cutting flowers. "I still can't believe how far you've come," she said. 6 months ago. You were working out of your sunroom." I looked around at the signs of growth. Art, books, tools, laughter in the air. I couldn't have done it without people like you, and students willing to take a chance. I think you gave people permission to care about beautiful things, to slow down, to learn something just because it's worth knowing. That evening I sat on my porch, with a glass of wine, watching the sky turn shades of rose and gold. The Mustang gleamed in the driveway. Through the studio windows, I could see silhouettes of plants waiting for morning shoppers. This life, teaching, creating, collaborating, had once seemed impossible. Now it felt inevitable, like I'd finally stopped getting in my own way. My phone buzzed. Riley. "Can't wait for the plant sale. Grandma's bringing the whole garden club." Then Mrs. Henderson. "Should I wear my good shoes or my gardening shoes?" And Marcus. "Need help setting up in the morning?" Each message reminded me I wasn't doing this alone. I'd built something that mattered, something that connected people and made space for beauty and learning. The scent of lilacs floated through the air. Children's laughter echoed down the block. Millbrook in spring was a place where beautiful things could grow. I thought of the pressed flower journal that started all this, still on my kitchen table, now joined by sketchbooks, class plans, and collaborative projects. The work had grown, from preservation to cultivation, from solitude to shared discovery. As the first stars appeared, I raised my glass in a quiet toast to the brother who'd broken my heart and inadvertently set me free, to the car that taught me how to want something for myself, to the leap of faith that became a life, and most of all, to the courage it took to believe that my own dreams were worth pursuing, and to the patient, joyful work of building a life that was fully, finally, mine. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.